Well, good morning. Thank you, Marlene. Thank you, Professor. Students, particularly in this last desperate home stretch in the last few weeks of the semester, I can relate. I may look ancient, but I was actually in your shoes. It seems like just yesterday. I'm always happy to talk about this project because it is such an interesting one from many aspects, not the least of which is that it is vital to the future of Cape Breton, to the future of Nova Scotia, to the future of Canada. And it is a project with international tentacles. As I look out across this audience, I am reminded that CBU is really quite unique in having such a diverse, wonderfully diverse student base. And that reminds me that many of our partners, in fact, on this project, come from around the world. And since this is a forum dealing with entrepreneurship, I want to talk about this project as a startup because I've been involved in a great many startups. And by the way, most startups fail, statistically. This one is not going to, but most of them do. And we may have a chance to talk about the why, but there are lots of good reasons why they fail, and it isn't always because it isn't a good idea. This will be a private sector enterprise that, like all startups, will involve work, risk, capital, and a little luck. Now, successful enterprises, new ones, come from two sources. You either meet a need or you solve a problem, or sometimes the two are the same. So it is vital that, if nothing else, when you leave here, you will understand the problem that we at the Port of Sydney are trying to solve. It is a very real problem. It is not just a Canadian problem, it is an international problem, and we think we have a very fine solution for it. But it is the key to our success. Now, too often, when talking about this opportunity, particularly here in Cape Breton, we tend to look at it from the inside out. We look at it from the perspective of how does this affect Sydney, how does this affect Cape Breton, or how does it affect Nova Scotia, which is legitimate and important. But I would like to take you on a journey, if you will, with me today over this brief period. I want you to come with me outside. I want to take you out there to see how the world, where our partners lie, see this project from the outside in. Only then, when you understand their perspective, you understand the problem we are trying to solve, that you can understand the importance of the project. And by the way, as we come closer in, perhaps towards the end of the project, perhaps in the questions, we'll have an opportunity to talk about the obstacles and the challenges. And there are a great many that we face. This is not a slam dunk. Now, as I said, we have a very real opportunity to make a difference here for Cape Breton and for the country, but we are not guaranteed success. We are going to have to earn that success. And it's one thing to have a vision, but there is a difference between a vision and an hallucination. And sometimes we confuse the two. We get very excited about our vision without understanding that the vision is of no value without a value proposition, without hard work, without assembling and attracting the necessary capital, and as I said earlier, without a little luck. So let's examine the problem we're trying to solve. To begin with, 2/3 of the goods of the world are shipped by sea today. 2/3. Prior to the arrival of containers in the 1950s, ships were unloaded with cranes and windlasses and nets and pallets. And aside from the arrival of some motorized equipment, the process for unloading ships in 1950 was not really unlike the process for unloading ships in 1750 when they were unloading outside of Louisburg. It worked, but it was inefficient, it was costly, and as a result, it was a drag on trade. Containerization changed all that in the late 1950s and 60s. Containerization revolutionized shipping globally. Instead of using windlasses, we are now transporting containers. I cannot underestimate the import of that change in technology. Ports around the world were forced to adapt to this new technology and methodology, and no one was spared. This was a classic disruptive technology. The whole process was disruptive, painful, and expensive. And by the way, those themes are going to come up again. Disruptive, painful, and expensive when we look at what lies ahead for us and indeed for the transportation world as a whole. But through the pain, efficiency skyrocketed, costs dropped, trade boomed, living standards rose, and the payoff, the economic payoff, was enormous. Now this brings us to the bigger ships, which we'll review in the slides here in a moment. Today, container shipping lines in search of economies of scale are introducing ever larger container vessels. Ship capacity has gone from 3,000 to 4,000 containers as an average, to 8,000 and 9,000 containers, to, in the last 20 years, leviathans of 18, 20, 22, 23,000 containers. I'm going to show you some pictures of these ships in a minute. You'll understand the immense size of these vessels. There is now talk of designing an articulated, which means it's in two parts connected, articulated container vessel that can carry an astonishing 34,000 containers. Now, I'm going to show you the MS Oscar in a moment, which was the biggest container ship in the world for about 12 weeks. And that gives you a sense, when you see the Oscar, your jaws will drop. And to understand that it was the biggest ship, container ship in the world for about 3 months. And then it was overtaken by an even larger container ship. It gives you some sense of the momentum inside the industry. Now, shipping lines, now we're getting into the problems that we're trying to solve. Shipping lines are turning to these larger vessels because the shipping lines, are under relentless downward cost pressure. They must reduce their costs to survive. And part of the solution to this problem, by the way, there's a problem. There's a problem waiting to be solved. And part of the answer, part of the solution, is ultra-large container ships. But these ships, by the way, and there are now hundreds of them either at sea or on order, none of them can dock in North America. None of them. And that itself is another problem waiting to be solved. Now, these larger ships, they cut operating costs almost in half. So if you put yourself in the shoes of the shipping lines, your cost can be cut in half. The cost of delivering a container, the cost per container of delivery, can be cut almost in half. And these ships are very, very green. They consume half the fuel and emit half the emissions of the smaller vessels that they are replacing, and many of them today are dual-fueled. This means they can run on diesel, but more importantly, they can run on liquefied natural gas, which is the cleanest fuel of all. Now, the shipping lines introduced these, and I'm going to show you a slide in a moment about how these things came online, but they introduced these to try and reduce their costs. And there's probably a thesis to be written here. I'll throw it out. There's a thesis to be written here because the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, has put out a wonderful paper last year called The Big Ships. And in it, what they describe is the evolution of these ever-expanding vessels. And interestingly enough, what happened was we introduced containers, we revolutionized shipping in the early 60s, productivity skyrocketed, costs came down, living standards went up, everybody was a winner. So they said, well, let's do more. So we'll go from 3,000, 4,000 containers to 7,000, from 7,000 to 8,000, from 8,000 to 9,000, from 9,000 to 10,000, without realizing, this is the kernel of the thesis. If you're looking for help, I'll be an advisor. At some point, around 9,000 or 10,000 TEUs, which is a term for containers, they crossed the line, and it became a classic disruptive technology. Now, have you heard the term disruptive technology in the course of your classes? What that means is it's a technology that, when it's introduced, turns the whole industry on its ear. It starts to obsolete everything that came before it. I'll give you a military example, since I can't escape that as part of my background. And when the British introduced the dreadnought, which was an iron ship with large guns, iron, it rendered obsolete every wooden fleet in the world, almost overnight. That is a disruptive technology. The arrival of the microchip was a disruptive technology. The arrival of the smartphone was a disruptive. Look what it's done to traditional, call up Aunt B, Hello, Aunt. It's over. How many traditional wired phones do we see in homes? That's classic disruptive technology. Well, these ships became a disruptive technology. And what they did is by the way, they require a minimum of 50 feet. That's the point that Marlene was saying about how important it was to get the support of the federal and provincial governments to dredge this harbor down to well over 50 feet, because these ships are so heavy that they need enormous depth. And there is only one harbor other than ours that has 50 feet of depth on the East Coast, and it is not ready to accommodate these large vessels. They require enormous turning basins in here, and all those turning basins have to be dredged to the same level. They require massive unloading areas, because if you think about it, if you've got 20,000 containers coming off, you also have 20,000 containers, full or empty, that need to go on. So 20,000 instantly becomes 40,000. All right. That means that these harbors need enormous laydown space, and in many cases, they don't have them. The supporting rail and infrastructure, the transportation infrastructure behind the ports needs to be revolutionized. And that is what the OECD commented on, that it's not just the ports that have to change, but in fact the whole infrastructure behind the ports have to change. Now we're talking about national investments in infrastructure on a scale of which we haven't seen in decades. Now, unloading these vessels requires the application of state-of-the-art technology. It cannot be done in the old way with old manual ports or semi-manual ports. They'll simply be overwhelmed by the surge of containers. It has to be done in an automated way. It has to be done with computers. It has to be done with lasers. It has to be done with the very latest technology. And remember I said about laydown space. Old ports hemmed in by urban development and high-cost waterfront real estate are at a particular disadvantage. Old ports. Well, guess what? Go up and down the east coast of North America, and what are you going to find? Old ports. Basically, the cities are there because the port was there. So the port came, the city grew, and it grew, and it grew, and it grew. Until it's hemmed in. If you look at the Port of New Jersey, it is hemmed in by more than 500,000 people around it. Right? Now, we were in Asia, and somebody suggested to us, well, just move them. And of course, that's not possible in the North American context, to move them, which means these ports are constrained, and they're never going to have the laydown space. If you look at the port of Halifax, which is a wonderful port, and a reasonably successful port. But look at, if you've been to Halifax, any of you have been to Point Pleasant Park? All right, well, Point Pleasant Park is this marvelous green space at the end of Halifax. But if you look out, you'll see this container terminal that is hemmed in by Point Pleasant Park and all of the multi-million-dollar real estate that's around it. In order for them to be able to take in 20,000 TEU ship every week, they would have to basically confiscate Point Pleasant Park and turn it into container laydown zones. So remember, for containers, you need cheap land. Most of the land in these urban centers facing the waterfront is not cheap. It is the most expensive real estate in the city. So these old ports are facing an enormous challenge. Now, having said that, and that, by the way, would explain why there is no port today in North America that can accommodate these massive ships. But there are ports around the world that can. There are ports in Europe, and they have all of the urban development problems. God knows places like Rotterdam and Amsterdam are hemmed in. But the ports in Europe are adapting. Ports in the Middle East are adapting. Ports in Asia are adapting. And as a result, today, these massive ships can, in fact, travel from Asia to the Middle East and to Europe. But that's as far as they go. And then they have to go back because those are the only ports able to accommodate them. And by the way, these accommodations in the Middle East, in Asia, in Europe, have cost tens of billions of dollars. This has not been a cheap adaptation. And by the way, it's ongoing. Even the Suez and Panama Canal, the greatest feats of engineering of the 19th century, have been forced to adapt. Both canals have been widened or twinned, and I'll show you a picture of the twinning here in a minute. In the case of the Panama Canal, next year it will be able to accommodate post-Panamax vessels of about 12 to 13,000 containers. These efforts to twin and expand the Suez Canal, and by the way, Suez Canal is the only canal able to handle all these vessels because you're not plowing through a mountain, you're plowing through desert. There are no locks involved. It goes down to a depth of 60 and 70 feet, so it can handle, it's the one canal that can handle everything. But the cost in dredging, in upgrading ports and transportation infrastructure, in raising bridges, they're raising the Bryan Bridge in New Jersey. Imagine what that's going to cost. The money being spent is staggering. The cost of just adjusting the canals today is about $15 billion, and that cost, I predict, write it down, is going to double. When the final bills come in, it'll be more like a $30 billion project. Now this brings us closer to home in North America, where the North American response to this challenge, to this problem, and by the way, a problem is always an opportunity from an entrepreneurial point of view, our response has been slow and sluggish. At present, there's no port on the eastern seaboard, and frankly, no port anywhere that can handle 18 to 20,000 TEU vessels. Not only are the ports unready, but the transportation infrastructure behind these ports is in many cases antiquated. So in other words, it's no point fixing the port to bring these vessels in if the roads and the bridges and the rail cannot accommodate them. And so every dollar you're spending on the port, you're going to have to spend $2 or $3 behind the port to be able to adapt. That was the point that the OECD was raising about the cost of this disruptive technology. Because we have not adapted, because we have not invested, the result is now chronic congestion and late deliveries that disrupt just-in-time inventory systems across North America. We are the laggards. Our port productivity is poor, amongst the poorest of the developed world, if you count the transportation developed world. North America is not just behind, we are falling behind, and we continue to fall behind. And that, by the way, is going to undermine our standard of living. Worst of all, or throw it into the mix, is labor unrest. Our ports have been plagued by chronic labor unrest. In 2014, there was a major strike on the West Coast that shut down the U.S. West Coast. And you probably saw it as a little headline, you know, West Coast strike drags on. What does that mean? You know what that means? That strike cost 1/2 of a percentage point off the GDP, the gross domestic product of the United States. 1/2 a point of GDP on the world's largest economy is a big deal. That's how big that cost was, and the strike was only about 8 weeks. That gives you some, and by the way, 8 weeks. It then took half a year to undo the congestion that resulted. Now, the good news for us is that it's the shippers have said, we'll never ever get burned like that again. We'll never have all our eggs in the West Coast basket ever again. That meaning U.S. West Coast basket. Traffic is shifting. We see traffic shifting to Vancouver. We see traffic shifting to Prince Rupert. You know, Prince Rupert is way up in northern British Columbia. And by the way, when you say every port has to be near a big urban center, Prince Rupert is a tremendously successful port, way up there, a gateway port, and that is doing very well, that is growing, and because of this West Coast strike, is going to gain more traffic in the years ahead. So the Canadian West Coast will benefit. For us, the relevant thing is that it has driven more traffic to the East Coast. So there's traffic now that's going north to Canada. There's traffic that's coming to the East Coast, some of it through the Panama Canal, some of it through the Suez Canal, but it is traffic that used to go to the West Coast. It used to be 65-35 split between trade between the West and East Coast containers. The projection is that will very soon go to 50-50. And the shift is structural. You know what the term structural means? It's an economic term. It means it's not temporary. It's not flippant. It's not going to, like a tide, is going to come and go. It's structural. It may not mean it's permanent, but it means it's semi-permanent. I guess if we don't respond, if we don't do anything to capture that traffic, yeah, I suppose it could start to flow back to the, but right now it's a structural shift that's going to last for many years into the future. So you see, there are big problems out there that are looking for solutions. And these problems, driving down the costs for shipping lines, developing ports able to accommodate these ultra-large ships, investing in our infrastructure so that Canada and North America can participate in this next revolution. Those represent problems that need to be solved, and they represent huge business opportunities. Now, with that, I'm going to switch over to the cartoons. That is the MS Oscar. It was the biggest ship in the world for about 12 weeks. Now I want you to look at that. Do you see these little things under here, under that bubble, these tiny little things? That is not just people, that's equipment. That gives you some sense of the size of these massive vessels. These, by the way, are benchmarks. Your term benchmarking, if you haven't heard it before, it's a quality control term. It's where you go to the best and you say, okay, what are they doing well that we're going to copy? That's benchmarking. And these are our benchmarks. And in the case of, for example, Port Khalifa, the engineer that we have working with us from Bechtel, Rex Grundle, actually built and ran the port of Khalifa, and he's on our team. So Khalifa is one of our benchmarks. The other is Busan and the port of Shanghai, which, by the way, handles about 30 million containers a year. 30 million. I mean, we're talking here about shooting for 2 to 3 million containers, and it would make us probably the biggest player on the East Coast. They handle 30 million containers. Okay, the factors driving change, the expansion of the canals, the shift in traffic from the West Coast, the additional traffic to the East Coast, the big ships. This is a good picture of the twinning of the canal. I mean, there it is. Suez Canal is being twinned at enormous cost. And by the way, it's on target. The Egyptians raised the money themselves. The first $8 billion, they're going to need billions more than that, but they'll get it. Now, this is a sense for the container ships. Here you see the size of the container ships. You'll notice this line across the middle. You see that line? That's the point. When they started getting above 10,000 TEUs, this became a disruptive technology. Suddenly, the old infrastructure could not cope, globally could not cope. And now we're looking at ships of 20 and 22 and 24,000 TEUs. It gives you some sense. And by the way, look how fast this has happened. We're talking about this happening over a period of about 40 years, which is fast in terms of change. Driving change. What is driving change? The arrival of the big ships, the expansion of the Suez Canal, the strike on the West Coast, which really shook shippers up. They're never, ever going to put all their eggs in one basket again. The expansion of the Panama Canal and downward, relentless cost pressure on the shippers. This, by the way, is a quote from Michael White, head of Maersk Lines, who is a great critic, by the way, of the North American port systems. And he says, well, you read it. Change is needed, and change is coming, whether we like it or not. He also says about the big ships, get used to them, there's only going to be more of them. The problem. Here's the definition of the problem. Port productivity in North America is declining with old technology, old practices, old labor approaches, labor unrest. These are all underinvestment in port and transportation technology. Chronic congestion on both ports. Today, if you go to the Port of New Jersey, you will see a 6-mile-long traffic jam of trucks lining up, burning gasoline to inch in to the Port of New Jersey. It's something one would expect to see in a third world port, not in a first world port, but it's a reflection of where we are. So costs are up, productivity is down, and North American ports have become, and this, by the way, is a quote from a shipping line that we're working with, have become not just expensive. This is deadly. Imagine if this was your customer. You have become not only expensive, you have become unreliable. And in the shipping business, reliability is as important as cost because you're tied to these intricate just-in-time delivery systems. The solution, a new build on the East Coast. You're not going to be able to do this with a retrofit deep enough to accept all of the new ultra-large vessels, by the way, we qualify, designed specifically around the needs of the shippers. Traditionally, you build a port and they'll come. How about this? How about when we start to build a port, we get them in and we build it around their needs, employing the very latest technology. And we are in negotiations with the latest technology providers, become the low-cost service provider on the East Coast, and of course provide transportation that's intermodal, transshipment, rail, roadway, and the Port of Sydney. This is a good picture of the dredge site. The Greenfield site is in white. There's a 1,200-acre logistics park behind it. And by the way, when you look at the future of this port, the future of this hub, and the economic impact it can have, the port is vital. But the zone behind it, the intermodal zone behind it, is going to be just as important. There's another look at the port. This is one of my favorite slides. Sydney is the most important piece of maritime real estate on the East Coast. I'm telling you that because it's true. And it's not because of any great brain trust that I have or Marlene has. It has to do with geography. We are the first stop on the Great Circle route for any ship coming from Europe and any ship coming through Suez. Geography makes this a strategic location. And by the way, that's why the French built the port and fortress at Louisbourg. Geography. This will not only be a gateway port, but also a transshipment port, and we have very aggressive plans for developing transshipment strategies that carry cargoes inland, which means we have to partner with Montreal and with Quebec and with Chicago and Detroit, and we have to partner inland. We have to partner with rail. This can't be, oh, here's the port, let everybody catch up. The system has to be integrated, and that has not happened previously in North America. That just shows what's called the magic Y. That's CN's rail lines, but you'll notice that they go right out here. You'll see that they go right out there to Cape Breton, and they go right up there to Prince Rupert. See, Prince Rupert's way up at the top there. By the way, we are 500 miles closer to Chicago than Prince Rupert. Our strategy, this is important. Design around the requirements of these ultra-large ships, specialize in that. Partner with the St. Lawrence Seaway, the Great Lakes, H2O, Montreal, the inland ports. Become part of China's One Belt, One Road, New Silk Road strategy, which is an inspiring vision for bringing the world together and raising world standards by enhancing trade, and we are already in those negotiations at the present time. Partner with Suez. Suez is looking for partners. Suez wants to beat Panama. They are looking for partners. They are open for partners. And by the way, we are the first stop for a ship coming out of Suez. And to seek incremental traffic. There's a lot of traffic that's not coming to us now because we don't have the capacity to manage the big ships. They're going to Europe and they come to us on smaller ships. By the way, that means higher cost, right? That means every ship, every piece of cargo coming into North America, into the NAFTA area, it's more expensive to bring something in incrementally, and it's more expensive to send something out. If that isn't fixed, NAFTA will be placed at a permanent structural. What did I say about structural? Structural is permanent or nearly permanent. A structural cost disadvantage. And what does that mean? Everything you buy in the store will be more expensive. Your job opportunities will be less. Your standard of living will be lower. So the issues we're talking about here transcend Cape Breton. They are national issues. And our approach, because we have come under a lot of criticism. The first thing it might be a Nova Scotia tradition, it might be a Cape Breton tradition. I don't know where I'm from away, so I know nothing. But it does seem to me that when you try and introduce a new idea, there's a whole bunch of reasons why it can't be done. And our approach to that is every time we take a punch, we could hit back. But we're not. It's just not. What we want to do is offer a solution. This is our philosophy, which, by the way, comes from Benison, who founded Amnesty International. Better light a candle than to curse the dark. If there's a problem, find a solution. The solution represents an opportunity. The opportunity then becomes something an entrepreneur can sink their teeth into. But remember, it comes down to solving a problem, having a value proposition, having the capital, having the partners, hard work. Oh, did I say hard work? Hard work and a little luck. And now I'll take questions. Marlene and I will take questions because she's going to handle all the tough ones.
So, does anyone have any questions of Barry or Marlene? Or anybody write any down that they want me to ask on your behalf? Yes.
So it's drenched. You have the greenfield site. Why haven't you started building before?
Well, good question. Fair question. Because all the pieces are not in place yet. We have financing partners. The financing partners are waiting for us to sign up the first shipping partners. The technology partners are ready, but we have to sign agreements with them. There's an awful lot of moving parts. So the fact that we're making progress, the fact that I think we're going to be successful, would not want you to leave here and think that next Monday we're going to be breaking ground out there. This will be the largest maritime project in North America when it gets going. It's going to be a multi-billion-dollar mega project, and we have to have all of our ducks in a row before it takes off. So as enthusiastic as I have been today, I would also want you to know that there's a long road ahead of us to hoe. And there's a great deal of challenges ahead. There are still things that could go wrong. I would just say there's a heck of a lot going more right today than a year ago. And don't forget, we've been at this for 2 years now. We've been at this for 2 years. We've been traveling I've got enough stamps on my old luggage to prove that. So these things take time because it's not something that can be done here in Canada exclusively. We require international partners. It's going to take time.
Barry, in supplement to Martin's question, what would you say if you had to identify it today? What's your next step you need to get done? What's the next thing to tick off?
You want to answer that?
Well, the next thing we have to secure our shipping lines. We have to have, this is not build it and they will come. A project of this scope and size at over $1 billion, you need to have your partners signed on. You need long-term commitments. Obviously, if you're investing that type of money, you need 10-year commitments to do this project. And so we are in those discussions now, and they need to be contracted.
Any other questions?
So in terms of, trying to get everything into place, in terms of how will you get people to build the port as in terms of employment? Are you guys going to look more towards local, trying to hire local to bring jobs into the community?
Well, I would say that it is an international project, and those skill sets in terms of the construction will be not only local but international. This will require huge capacity in the construction and trades, but there'll be hundreds and hundreds of local jobs. if not thousands, when this project is finished.
The Port of Montreal, which handles 1.4 million containers a year, supports 18,000 jobs. So that's, and we're shooting for a number higher than that in terms of containers.
You know, I probably can't even begin to highlight the various different business opportunities. The first major one will be with the construction and the trades that will be required for this project. You know, you're talking three or 4 year construction project. That would be thousands, obviously, of trades that will be required. But I think one thing, if we get out at the start of this and tell people what those trades are and what type of trades that they will be employing, then that'll be real opportunity. But besides that, you think about when the terminal's created, the logistics park, the warehousing, the customs agents, the shipping agents. There'll be so many different types of opportunity and spin-offs from the terminal itself and the logistics park. You know, I really wouldn't even want to try to give you a comprehensive view of that, but there'll be lots of opportunities.
Savannah is a good model for us.
Savannah, Georgia.
Savannah, Georgia, which is my, yes, it's where I run to in the winter. It has an enormously successful logistics park. I mean, it stretches for right up the Savannah River, almost forever. And it is now the second largest employer in all of Georgia, and Georgia's an active, robust state, right? So those jobs are being created primarily out of the logistics park. For example, you can set up manufacturing operations. You can bring in material. You can assemble in a tax-free zone, and then you can export without ever having any taxation on it. Think of the advantages of that. Think of the advantage of that for fisheries. Think of the advantage of that for light manufacturing. I mean, anybody who makes anything would probably want to be making it inside that free trade zone. If you're going to export it, and by the way, great many of our businesses, as Mike can tell you, he's done the research on it, great many of our businesses here in Cape Breton export, surprisingly.
Yeah, just think of all the impact that would have on housing development, on, you know, the service industry, hospitality, tourism. I mean, you've got to accommodate. I mean, mind you, there's lots of people in the area who need a job, but there'd be all kinds of people coming in as well. So you've got to accommodate them, you know, and it's the road infrastructure and the schools and teaching jobs. That would be lovely, wouldn't it?
Yeah. Yeah.
Now, I have a question, if I may. Are you making the assumption that should you get the contracts with the shippers, et cetera, that the rail line will reopen and that it'll be improved and it'll be able to accommodate all of these containers that need to get off of the ships onto the mainland and wherever else they need to go?
Well, yeah, the answer is, in short, yes. We have met with both Genesee and Wyoming and CN Rail to discuss the project and the scope of this project. And if this project, when this project comes to reality, the rail issue will be solved. That type of infrastructure capital investment that's required, it will be more than justified because the rail obviously would be profitable and would have more than enough traffic to be successful.
So are you confident enough at least that they're not going to pull up the rail anytime soon?
We're working with them in that regard.
Yeah, we're working on that. The only way to save the rail is through the port.
Yeah.
And but the rail lines are businesses.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
They're not social agencies. They're businesses. If we have traffic for them, they'll play.
Yeah.
So it might be take 1 year or 2 years to start to building this product, right?
We expect it. We hope it will be faster than that to start. And we're looking at, with our partners Bechtel, at fast tracking. But there's a lot of things we have to put in place. It's taken us 2 years to get where we are. So we're having good success, but the next year is going to be critical. And remember, I said no guarantees, but I'm optimistic.
And there was another question over
Yes,
there.
just
Becky.
following up
Yes.
with your question, actually, for what Dr. Lee said. I was just wondering that with your presentation, as you mentioned, that North America is falling behind is in terms of the just-in-time inventory not being able to access this. What would you guys like to focus on in transportation-wise? I know it's between the airlines and the shipping itself and roads, but in terms of the just-in-time, how would you guys like to focus more on that?
What's required is, if I could answer that question by moving it to one level up. The logistics people that do the just-in-time, guess what? They know what they're doing. They know how to do what they do. They're good at it. It would boggle your mind to see how intricate some of these systems are. The problem is not with them, who we are in the discussions with now. The problem is that Canada lacks a coherent transportation policy, in particular in Eastern Canada, because they have done a good job at the Pacific Gateway, where they have policy, they have investments, they have a strategy, they have the rail online. That's why it's working. Eastern Canada has been an afterthought, and so there are a range of policy issues that have to be talked about. I mean, it's not just investment in rail. It's not just investment in roads. It's not just investment in airlines. It's how do you integrate those? How do we make ourselves easy to deal with? Right now, the shippers will tell you it's a hard place to do business with, because you go to one window and, okay, well, I just been to that window. They told me something different from this window, and now I got to go to this window. Oh, then there's a security window. We need one window. So that means changes in policies, changes in regulations. We have cabotage rules. You know, cabotage is how much you can carry inside Canada. We have cabotage rules that are 100 years old, designed to protect Canadian flag ships that don't exist. Right? So we can't carry anything from here to Montreal or back because only Canadian ships can do. We have any Canadian ships? No. Okay, what are we going to do? Well, let's go to lunch. So these policy issues have to be dealt with. So when we're talking about, you think about it's a construction and at one level, getting the shippers, we have work to do here at home in Canada. We have a new government now, and you know, we have. I think the timing is right, but these issues have to be dealt with. They won't solve themselves. And by the way, there are unions that want to keep those old cabotage rules. There are even shipping companies that are not quite sure. They say, well, we might want to have a container ship 20 years from now. So let's shut down the whole damn system in case we want to catch up and launch a ship one day. I mean, this is, and by the way, we're not alone. The Americans have the Jones Act, which is even crazier. That was designed to protect their American bottoms, their American ships. There are none left. American Merchant Marine, the Jones Acts, and the unions drove them out of business. So there are only foreign flag vessels if you want a transshipment strategy. You want to get traffic into Montreal, you want to get traffic into the Great Lakes, we're going to have to change cabotage rules. That's going to take time. That's going to take effort. It's going to take intellectual effort. A big part of what we have to do is a whole intellectual effort around policy. So, you know, we have a lot of balls in the air. That's why I run away to Savannah.
Yeah, we'd like to come with you.
Yes, you're all invited.
Well, thank you so very much, both of you, for coming, and the rest of your entourage as well for being here today. So let's thank them.